It is 1810 Irish time. I don't know what it is where you are. So we will start. Michele, is it Michele or Michele? Michelle. What are you calling it? Michelle. 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 I thought as much, but I couldn't quite remember. Michelle is Kueter Petersen is an adjunct professor in Iowa City, and her most recent book is Hermeneutics of Contemplative Silence, Paul Ricoeur, Edith Stein, and the Heart of Meaning, in the series Studies in the Thought of Paul Ricoeur. She's also published on other items, but I think that might just suffice as an introduction. I think it's a major feat that you got that book out, so congratulations very much for that. Michelle, we'll really look forward to your paper.
Thank you very much. A Mirror to Reality, Edith Stein and Religious Consciousness. Introduction. As a figure in philosophy of religion, Edith Stein is enigmatic, even as the study of her person is sometimes confounding within the context of issues relating to interreligious dialogue and religious identity. Her vibrant philosophical pursuits are entwined with and mirror the most important intellectual and cultural movements of the 20th century, including phenomenology, neo-scholasticism, and existentialism. Against the backdrop of the cataclysmic events associated with the period of the world wars, her philosophy and her person serve as a generative source of genuine religious consciousness, something she refers to in her earliest writings. From formal study to everyday life, Stein brings rigorous thinking to bear on life experience, which results in a dynamic and rich account for the ages of what it is and what it means to be human. Moreover, her paramount concern with accessing reality foreshadows her witness to a living mysticism. She lives out the mystery of her person consistently to the end of her days, as she attests to in some of her final personal letters. By examining the various facets of the subject and subjectivity, the role of an ever more fully embodied reason with heart emerges as a center of religious consciousness for Stein. She learns to acknowledge and reckon with her limitations while also being an open conduit to reality. Stein teaches us what it is to humanize life in our day among the swirling tide of debate surrounding artificial intelligence, techno-algorithms, and anti-science bias at a time when human attention is increasingly being commodified. I shall proceed in part one by discussing the subject in the early work of Paul Ricoeur in order to provide a robust philosophical context for Stein's thought in her pursuit of truth and reality in what follows. Part two shall focus on the subject in Stein and her developing theological interests as they relate to religious consciousness. And finally, part three shall elucidate her spirituality of existence, followed by a few concluding remarks. Part one, the Ricoeurian subject, existence and transcendence. I begin with discussion of Ricoeur and some of what are his earliest writings, as they are in response to and engaged in phenomenology, neo-scholasticism, and existentialism, even as they evolve into a mature philosophical anthropology and philosophical hermeneutics. His thought can help explain the conditions for the possibility of what Stein claims in her thought and sometimes lends explanatory power and clarification to her work. He also rejects Husserl's idealism. He offers a description of the lived experience of embodiment by employing the notions of fault and mystery as he draws from the work of his mentor, Gabriel Marcel, in his first major text, Freedom in Nature, the Voluntary and the Involuntary. Edward Bering notes in his text, Converts to the Real, Catholicism and the Making of Continental Philosophy, that while Maurice Merleau-Ponty prematurely tries, quote, to reconcile phenomenology and by extension neo-scholasticism with existentialism, end of quote, and reaches atheistic conclusions, Ricoeur is able to develop, quote, a religious version of phenomenology by presenting a more robust description of the human subject. What is significant about their work, as Bering points out, is that they bracketed the objective sciences to make us aware of our embodiment and that connects us to existence and challenges idealism. Human being, for Ricoeur, is always faced with a duality, a two-in-one structure that is never overcome. There is a rift, a fault in freedom in nature, the voluntary and the involuntary. He explains that, quote, not all the involuntary is motive or organ of the will. There is also the inevitable, the absolutely involuntary with respect to decision and effort, whether in the form of character, of the unconscious, of biological life. It is the terminus of that original act of willing. To this I consent, end of quote. For him, it is important to attend to, quote, cogito's complete experience, including even its most diffuse affective margins, end of quote. So there's intentionality on the one hand and reference to a self on the other hand, which are the marks of a subject. If we are to understand the truth of the relation between the involuntary and the voluntary, then, quote, he says, we must constantly reconquer the cogito grasped in the first person from the natural standpoint. And of course, we're going to see the agreement with Stein there on the natural standpoint. The cogito's experience includes our existence as a body. This common subjectivity forms the basis for the homogeneity of voluntary and involuntary structures. He explains that, quote, the nexus of the voluntary and the involuntary does not lie at the boundary of two universes of discourse, one of which would be reflection concerning thought and the other concerning the physical aspects of the body. Cogito's intuition is the intuition of a body conjoined to a willing which submits to it and governs it. It is, and this is my emphasis, the meaning of the body as a source of motives, as a cluster of capacities, and even as necessary nature, end of quote. That is important. The task, he says, is to discover necessity in ourselves in the first person, that is, as the nature which we are. So the opposition he sets up is important to note, as he is providing for the multiplicity of subjectivity in that it is both internal and external. And it's at this point that he gets into the whole notion of empathy, which I don't have time for here, space for here. And this internal and external, which has to do with the opposition between two attitudes, with both having, quote, recourse to introspection or extrospection, but within two different frames of mind, end of quote. He explains that introspection can be naturalized in that a personal body, someone's body can be my body or your body, and external knowledge can in turn be personalized. So there's a dualism. A moment that belongs to the cogito can indicate a moment that is connected to the object body. Ricoeur gives the examples of movement or secretion, and a moment that belongs to the object body points to a moment that is connected to a subject, whether it has to do with affectivity or function. So he wants to extend the cogito so that it includes and appropriates the personal body. The ego, he says, has to renounce, quote, the wish to include, to posit itself so that it can receive the nourishing and inspiring spontaneity which breaks the sterile circle of the self's constant return to itself. This, quote, rediscovery of roots requires a type of attention other than an intellectual attention to structures, he says. It requires that I participate actively in my incarnation as a mystery. I need to pass from objectivity to existence, end of quote. The mystery which I am demands that I become one with it, that I participate in it so that I do not observe it as confronting me at a distance as an object. This participation is in conflict with the objectivity that is characteristic of phenomenology. With the advent of consciousness, he says, spontaneity appears as a quote unquote injurious force and loses its naivete. That is, the involuntary appears in terms of, quote, a hostile force, primarily as an invincible nature, a finite personality, an indefinite unconscious, and a contingent organic life. While voluntary movement has to do with effort, which is not only stimulation of docile capacities, but also a struggle against resistance, end of quote. So for Ricoeur, then, the difficulties of reconciling freedom and nature especially the tendency of the eye to close that circle, or the solipsism of the romantics, so to speak, implicitly raises the question of the fault. So I'm going to address the fault momentarily. But first, I want to note that he explains how there is an abstraction of transcendence. So what he's going to do is he's going to have an abstraction of the fault, but also of transcendence. So first, transcendence. Only then is it, quote, possible to restore the meaning of freedom understood as a dialogue with nature, end of quote. He wants to reveal the power to posit as well as to receive my emphasis in freedom. Further, he proposes, quote, and again, I want to emphasize this phrase, a far more intimate reception, which freedom achieves in its very power of positing acts. Perhaps, he says, the body is an insecure form of transcendence, and the patience which leans on the insurmountable bodily condition is a veiled form of yielding to transcendence. The myth of innocence and the assurance of unique creation beyond the rent of freedom and necessity accompany as hope our search for conciliation between the voluntary and the involuntary. End of quote. Ricoeur, and Bering emphasizes this point about Ricoeur, asks why this dualism of freedom and necessity is seemingly invincible. It is not only that there is a quote unquote rent in that the intellect has a weakness in being able to grasp what is a mystery. And what is that mystery? The mystery is that of the union of soul and body, but that in addition, there is an existential fault that is, quote, a secret wound inscribed in the human act of existing, end of quote. The lived experience of broadening subjectivity to the very limits of incarnation enables us to, Ricoeur says, approach the strange bond which joins the subjective power in the creative act and makes them simultaneously one and two, the same and different. The fault is likened to a bondage which reveals itself by an even deeper certitude and illustrates how we live deeper than we think. How do we know this? We are certain that we could have done and been other than what we are. Ricoeur refers to this as unarticulated experience, which feeds conceptual interpretation and extends it in the direction of living existence of body and freedom. So he believes that, quote, Husserl has not stressed sufficiently the extent to which meanings in the region of consciousness are fragile and transitory. The experience of freedom is in itself a transitory experience which must ceaselessly be recovered by action of the self on the self, end of quote. Okay, and then he goes on to say, however, I need not act on myself, respect humanity as an end in itself, in order for them to continue to appear to me as things. So this natural attitude is the condition of their appearance, and it is permanent, he says. So I must actively affirm, and he uses the word acquiesce, and I know that comes up also in the work of Chauvet. I must actively affirm, that is, acquiesce to, as opposed to self-assertion on the one hand or submission on the other hand, the many limitations of my will given my situation, if there's going to be some sort of reconciliation between the involuntary and the voluntary. So he argues in reference to Karl Jaspers that consent implies a leap from existence to transcendence. Ricoeur says, in closing this part on him, quote, if I do not accept myself as nature with my capacities and my limitations, I do not accept the whole. And that's a really key phrase of his in light of what is to come with Stein. Hope, he says, quote, wills to convert all hostility into a fraternal tension within a unity of creation, a Franciscan knowledge of necessity. I am with necessity among creatures, end of quote. And finally, Ricoeur advocates for the use of the term admiration of the whole as a way to live out this consent and necessity. Part 2, the Steinian subject, reason and faith as a symbiotic relationship. I begin with Stein's reworked dialogical comparison between Husserl and Thomas Aquinas, first published as an article. She summarizes her comparison by giving the most generous reading of both medieval and modern philosophers, as she explains that they understand the work of philosophy to be about comprehending the world in the most universal way possible and as deeply grounded as is possible. The main difference is between a subject who is theocentric in orientation and one who has that egocentric orientation. She says, quote, Husserl seeks the absolute starting point in the immanence of consciousness. For Thomas, it is faith. She acknowledges how each philosophy is characterized by dissimilar goals and dissimilar conceptions, which gives an entirely different slant to each respective philosophy when considered, quote, as a whole. So she's even considering philosophy as a whole, not only the subject as a whole. For Thomism, God is first truth is the basis for the notion of the divine and for the being and knowing of the divine. Natural knowledge and revelation flow from divine knowledge. The divine imparts essence and existence along with, quote, the extent and manner of its knowing and striving. And of course, that's key for, the evolution of her interiority and indeed the development of her interiority. As Stein notes, everything comes under this Thomistic ontology as far as content in the different areas of study, although, and she lists here 3, logic, knowledge, theory, and ethics, for example, can be taken up as disciplines in their own right. For transcendental phenomenology, according to Stein, the question is, quote, how is the world constructed for a consciousness that I can explore in immanence, the inner and outer world, the world of nature and mind, and ultimately the world charged with religious meaning, end of quote. So the constitutive issues that are central to Husserl's work, while Thomism accommodates them, she says, but doesn't grant them to be of quote unquote fundamental significance. She thinks when, quote, existence is redefined as self-identifying for a consciousness, the intellect searching for truth will never be set at ease, end of quote. When meaning shifts because the divine is relativized, this results in the contradiction of faith. She concludes by encouraging each side of the scholastic and phenomenological methods to quote unquote spare no effort in the pursuit of analysis so as to appreciate the various viewpoints with an eye to uncovering what she says is their mutual relationship. For Stein's subject, reason and faith are understood as having a symbiotic relationship, and therefore the subject of religious consciousness is inclusive of both the egocentric and the theocentric orientation, with the ego grounded in the divine and eternal being as the ultimate referent, if we're speaking in hermeneutical terms there. She concludes the dialogue between the two figures by stating that philosophical problems always come out of and return to, quote, the transcendentally purified consciousness for Husserl and, quote, God and his relation to creatures for Thomas. She extends subjectivity here by implicating faith as integral to the subject. Moreover, she writes later in Finite and Eternal Being that her inquiry, quote, does not aim at confronting Thomistic and phenomenological theories of knowledge with each other, end of quote, something way beyond the scope of what she can hope to accomplish, she says at the time. She explains she's concerned with emphasizing, quote, the conviction which both theories have in common and which is significant in our context. That is, natural experience serves as, quote, the starting point of every kind of thinking that goes beyond natural experience, end of quote. And while she acknowledges that, quote, not all knowledge rests exclusively on experience, and even though there is rather a valid basis of experience which can be known by pure reason, it nonetheless remains the aim of all thinking to arrive at an understanding of the world of experience, end of quote. So she's deeply grounded in the human project, in the human condition, and in not only just human experience, but the total human experience, humanity as a whole. She explains that, quote, thinking which does not lead to the establishment of the bases of experience, but to the abrogation of experience is without any real foundation and inspires no confidence, end of quote. She qualifies her statement to mean that her reference is to the total world of experience, as there may be, some experiential facts, for example, that end up being illusory from subject to subject. So just as Ricoeur emphasizes the whole, Stein says too that it is important to understand how both multiplicity and unity, quote, the particular being, and quote, the oneness of being can be found side by side. Moreover, there is, quote, a coherently ordered whole about all existence, such that, quote, and this is coming from finite and eternal being, the oneness of being is the being of this whole, a being of which all the parts partake. So she's talking about participation. The meaning of the whole and parts has to do with the notion of the interlacing, and it's Verflechtung, of nature in the modern philosophical sense and mind. The world that is accessible to our sensory perception is, quote, interwoven with the intellectual world, and by way of an intentional relationship is united with the intellect, end of quote. An intentional relationship implies consent and even acquiescence, if we think with Ricoeur here. Beyond that, she says, quote, the totality of the created world refers back to divine ideas. And all real being, which comes to be and passes away, is anchored in the essential being of these divine ideas. The ultimate ground of divine oneness encompasses the total plenitude of being. And finally, she says, every finite intermediate link must ultimately refer back to, end of quote, the primordial ground, which has no beginning and no end. Stein issues an important critique in the Thomistic Husserlian dialogue concerning the experience of mysticism and mystical consciousness, and outlines how differing interpretations of the word intuition and viewing, Erschauen, have proven problematic for modern philosophers on different sides of the debate about religious experience. She says that it has been made to seem as if secular philosophers are making the claim that they can, quote, order up these illuminations at will without regard for their personal qualities. And non-religious modern philosophers, quote, consider mystical experience nothing more than a morbid mental state devoid of any relevance for knowledge, end of quote. But for the philosopher who truly understands, there is a heightened awareness, as she says, that is, quote, the living interpretation of the word behind the practice of Husserl's method, end of quote. And she goes on to explain that it is the meaning of those words that is important. Interpretation of personal mystical experience is important. But mystical experience, or mystical enlightenment, she uses the word enlightenment, does not simply happen because insights have to be acquired through a very exerting process of quote unquote painstaking intellectual effort, or Arbeiten. So what is significant about her work is the emphasis she places on the importance of reason for the development of interiority. Indeed, it is necessary and requisite, as Stein does indeed acknowledge, that some people may fail to reach the ultimate depth of their being and therefore perfection. And this is a two-stage process whereby there is an initial or preliminary possession of the soul, which even if, quote, an only transient abiding in the depth, end of quote, is marked by, quote, knowledge of the meaning of personal being, end of quote. This stage serves as a presupposition for a full self-possession. This knowledge can be gained either through what she refers to as the illuminations of that depth, by way of the crucial events of personal life and meaning, I would add, or it can be mediated through rational argumentation and instruction in the doctrine of the faith. And beyond that, quote, by a doctrine of religious faith, which pictures human life in this perspective, end of quote. So she explains then that, quote, reason and faith are both appeals of the soul, calling it to enter into its own self and to mold life from the innermost center, end of quote. So she has much more to say about this in the Science of the Cross. However, for purposes here, I can't go into it. And finally, to conclude part 2, she says that, quote, a conscious life of the soul in the depth of its interiority is possible only after the awakening of reason, end of quote. I think that's a really strong assertion on her part. Part 3, religious consciousness as a spirituality of existence. Religious consciousness has to do with an evolving interiority such that one can live out of the innermost center while at the same time allow that it is reason that penetrates the, quote, interiority of things, she says. The experience of sense perception and intellectual knowledge comes and goes, but the meaningful content of those experiences can be inwardly retained, sometimes forever. And she also discusses memory here. Memory can bring our experience to life again, she says. When external events are understood from one's own interiority, and there is a, quote, full intellectual power alive in his understanding, end of quote, and this thinking affects the body as well as perhaps through a quickened heartbeat, she mentions, or a variance in the rhythm of breathing, for example, then his person, quote, thinks with his heart, and his heart is the actual living center of his being, end of quote. The heart is the center because it is also where the interconnection of the body and soul are most keenly felt and experienced, she says. This center is also the locus of the depth of the personality where one lives collectively. Both reason and faith call the person, quote, to enter into its own self and to mold human life from the innermost center. The innermost center is also that which is the most spiritual, she says, aspect of the soul. The personal self radiates out from the innermost center of the soul and captivates others the more she lives collectively in the center. Individuality resides in this interiority of the soul. When a human being is, quote unquote, at home in this interiority, then the body is imbued, and she uses the word, and this is translated into English, impregnated, with the inner life while even being, quote unquote, spiritualized with it. Stein says, quote, here then is the true center of the being of body, soul, and spirit. The masters of the inner life of every age, end of quote, are drawn into the inmost center by a strong force that exceeds that of the external world in its entirety. This experience is the inbreaking of a superior life, and one that is spiritual, as one that is supernatural as well as divine. And so in conclusion of part 2, according to Stein, the soul, part 3, according to Stein, the soul is an entity. It has objective reality and individuality, individual being all by itself. The whatness of the soul has been placed into the world by God. And further, the soul in its interiority feels what it is and how it is. Stein likens this feeling to being dark and inexpressible as such. Quote, indicates to the soul the mystery of its being as mystery without clearly revealing this mystery, end of quote. So both activity and passivity are at work as, quote, the soul bears in its whatness the determination of what it is to become by virtue of what it receives and by virtue of what it does. The soul feels whether or not what it receives into itself is compatible with and beneficial for its own being, and whether or not what it does is in accord with the meaning of its being. And she says this compatibility or incompatibility is manifested in the condition in which the soul finds itself after, the soul has ongoing encounter with the world. So to conclude, Ricoeur, in his response to the 3 major philosophical movements of his day, provides the conditions for the possibility of the developed and evolving interiority of the religious consciousness that Stein so richly depicts. And Stein, by giving the most generous reading to both medieval and modern philosophy alike, provides a framework for thinking about existence in a relational way that is reflective of both an evolving humanity that we increasingly come to know and understand as shared, and a robustly embodied religious consciousness. A spirituality of existence is accepting of and therefore reflects all the vulnerability of the human condition with the humility of both knowing with all of one's heart and mind and consciously not knowing the depth of reality in which we live.
Thanks very much, Michele. That's really a wonderful breaking together of Ricoeur and Stein. There is a dialogue maybe missing there, which you are trying to fill in, and that's very helpful. Let's just take a few minutes for questions, although we are in principle already over time, but we have been that for a while, so let's not take that too seriously at this stage. Is there anybody who are burning with a question?
I just wonder, is there I really like the comments on the symbiosis of faith and reason, and also the idea of the heart as this connected center for both faith and reason. And yeah, I found the biological language very striking, both biological and spiritual as well. I just wondered if Michele, you would be able to send some sort of references for those, for quotations in Stein for those things. But it was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I don't seem to be able to get an overview of all the people who are here. I can only ever see the panelists. So I don't get to view. There's one question in the question and answers. Let's have a look. I think it's Lauren Lovestone. Do you think that Stein's thinking here, as you outlined implicitly, assumes we all have our own religious experience and consciousness? I think that's one takeaway. But how is this perhaps helpful to thinking about other people's religious experiences that obviously entail a religious consciousness?
I think that in her depiction, she, her language is so empathetic that it's really difficult to leave once you start reading her explanation of something. That I have this sense of from an empathic perspective, that she's her bodily being is part of the truth of what she's writing. And so I think for other people and other religious experience, that she teaches a way to learn how to think with someone else, and how to not only think with someone else, but how to be with someone else. So she's paradigmatic in that, I think. And, we have her earlier works that are grounded in some of those different, philosophy of the humanities and so forth. We have those to balance out. So, in other words, she knows what she's talking about, although it comes together beautifully in Finite and Eternal Being, which I primarily drew from that and the Husserlian dialogue with Thomas, for this paper, just by virtue of, limiting it. But I think if we go back into her early works, I think we'll find some truths that ring true to the humanistic sciences today, that allow us to, she's obviously appropriated it and taken it to a whole different level in Finite and Eternal Being. But I think that the vestiges of that are also included in her early works in terms of the study of the humanistic sciences. And so that there is, the truths of her earlier works would speak to human experience in general from another vantage point, to perhaps give us some ideas to round out some of these unconscious motivations and so forth that are floating around, a la Ricoeur, talks about that, that some of that can perhaps be sorted out in her early work. at least it's a beginning. So she definitely, her work has the capability to enter into conversation with human experience, just excluding the religious experience, just to talk about it in terms of human experience and feeling and encountering people. But then when we add the depth dimension to it, it takes on, I guess ultimately one can't prove anything with faith. It's the certitude is in the living of it and the testimony of it. And so she gives testimony to others about this religious consciousness.
Thanks very much. Michele, maybe we should, there's another question there I can see. Oh, that's just Lauren saying thank you. I'm sure others might want to continue the discussion, but in order not to stay here all night, I think it is time to move on to Samuel Stewart. Thank you very much, Michele. Samuel Stewart, let's see, can I find my way back here? Is going to present on a symbolic phenomenology of God, the significance of Dionysius the Areopagite in Edith Stein's later writings. He grew up in Durham, where he studied at the University of Cambridge. Briefly, he studied philosophy before switching and completing a BA in theology at Clare College. After a year working at Durham University, he returned to Cambridge for an MPhil in philosophy of religion, and he now lives in London and works for Royal Museums Greenwich while preparing for doctoral programs. So, Sam, we look very much forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. It'd be really nice to be in Mexico, but alas, my bedroom I have to do. Yeah, so I'm going to give an abridged version of my master's dissertation. I'll end up jumping quite quickly between the chapters and sections, but I would, of course, be more than happy to send the full text to anyone who's interested, and I would appreciate your expertise. So yeah, my title is A Symbolic Phenomenology of God. I'm looking at the significance of Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, in Edith Stein's later writings. I'll mainly focus on Ways to Know God, which is in the collection in English, Faith and Knowledge and Faith, The Science of the Cross. Both of those have been discussed today by other speakers. And I'll also be looking at a collection of hagiography in The Hidden Life, is the English copy of that. I read Stein's later writings as working towards what I've called this symbolic phenomenology of God. By that I mean a way of moving to God starting from the experience of phenomena understood as symbols. This is philosophically very problematic. I suggest, I won't really go into the reasons why, but I'll suggest its success for Stein is dependent on her adopting metaphysical principles from Dionysius, and also her commitments, which we can see from her early work, to empathy and realism in her phenomenological project. Before turning to Stein's later writings, I'll refer to just one powerful illustration of this empathy and realism in her early work. So this is in her doctorate. Stein's doctorate defends the thesis that when we encounter the tearful face of a grieving other, we're not presented only with bodily movements and the face, but we're presented with grief itself. So she effects a reduction from an experience, perceiving another person's face, to an essence, the raw, grieving vitality of the other. But, she stresses, we must not leave behind the phenomenon of the grieving face. To look at a grieving person and to see only the essence of grief is not to see the person and is not to empathize. So this movement beyond the external to the internal, which doesn't leave behind the external, relies on an actual contiguity between internal and external experience. It demands a grounding in reality that can be accessed intersubjectively. For the later Stein, it's God and her religious community which provide such grounds. talking about the early Stein, Alistair MacIntyre helpfully notes that for Stein, existential and metaphysical questions are always accompanied by the question, or question like, of what kinds of community should I be a member? Empathy, exercised in a community, generates a confidence in the reality of both subjects and objects, a confidence that the self appears to others as an object in their experience from which a vital essence, internal essence, can be disclosed. Empathy and realism work to counter phenomenology's tendencies towards idealism and even solipsism. Husserl was critiqued for this idealist turn, both by his contemporaries and more recently by thinkers involved with the religious turn in phenomenology, and also even more recently by people in the speculative realist movement, which is developing from some phenomenological thinkers. Stein seems to have prefigured these critiques of Husserl and has been committed to countering the tendency to idealism in phenomenology, even as she entered Carmel and eventually the kingdom of God, which she anticipated. If I just quickly share my screen, I think, is that working? Not sure. There we go. Yeah, so before I look into Stein's later writings, I'm going to quickly draw on Marie-Dominique Chenu to identify the specifically Dionysian understanding of symbol, which is opposed by Chenu to an Augustinian model of sign. So Chenu's primary distinction here is an idealist-realist distinction. Augustinian theology understands the operation of signs, symbols, as part of the human psyche, whereas for Pseudo-Dionysius, this is a quote from Chenu, it was not the believer who gave signs their meaning, it was the objective elements themselves. Chenu thus understood Dionysius as having realist tendencies. The operation of symbol for him is a normal part of the dynamism of the cosmos reaching up to God in hierarchical stages. Chenu explains that the symbol, in order to effect the transference for which it is the vehicle, calls for matter which does not disappear in the process of signifying. This, of course, resonates with Stein's empathetic treatment of a tearful face, which one must pass beyond in order to be empathetic, but which must not be allowed to disappear. So, I suggest by adopting some of these Dionysian notions as objective presuppositions, Stein gains the basis on which her symbolic phenomenology of God, that is, movement between phenomena and God, becomes possible. So, the subtitle of Stein's 1941 essay, Ways to Know God, which in English is in this collection, Knowledge and Faith, is The Symbolic Theology of Dionysius the Areopagite and its Objective Presuppositions. She explains that symbolic theology is a way to know God using names transferred from the things of sense to the divine. The underlying claim here is that phenomenal experience, analyzed properly, can be understood as pointing to and naming God, or at least as the beginning of a way to know God. Stein analyzes in this essay various accounts of such symbolic operations and experiences of God. She's very systematic about it, but she also explains what would objectively have to be the case for the language describing these experiences to truly speak of God. So the first big thing she does is she insists that at every point where positive theology is and theology is symbolic theology, she classifies as a type of positive theology. Every time where this is spoken, it must be disclaimed by negative theology. She draws on metaphysical principles underlying these two ways from Pseudo-Dionysius. We've got a quotation up on the screen, which is associating these positive and negative with apophatism and cataphatism, with the analogy of being and with the principle of greater dissimilarity. For Stein, it's important that these terms describe a subjective assent as well as an objective structure of reality. She says that upon completing the assent, positive and negative theologies give way to mystical theology, she says, which in utter stillness enters into union with the ineffable. So she's interested in the operations behind this assent. For her, this via triplex of positive, negative, and mystical theology refers to the movement of language along the structure of the hierarchical order of creation, from creatures to God. I think this process and symbolic operation she discusses in this context resembles a form of phenomenological reduction. So she stresses that by this category of symbols, images taken from the world of sense, the phenomena which symbolically refer to God, she means not only impressions on sense organs from the outside the body, but interior experience as well. She also admits into this category of images the combination of inner and outer experience in life experience, the imagery of one's life world. Now, she describes the correspondence and contiguity between inner and outer experience as a dovetail. There's a quotation giving that dovetail there. So, yeah, let me move. So explaining Dionysius' use of the Greek word for symbol, which comes from symbolo, she emphasizes its literal meaning as thrown together. So here we have both directionality and intentionality. For Stein, the experience of the symbolic image, or indeed of any sense experience, includes referrings that go beyond the given object. So the symbol is thrown together and it's got various referrings. Now, it's not that every referring in phenomena automatically lead to God, but if we understand phenomena as symbol, then they can. So she explains this by comparison to a natural scientist versus a symbolist. The natural scientist follows referrings to causality while they disregard other referrings. They do this in order to provide explanations of phenomena. But Stein claims, if one is unbiased and genuinely open to experience of phenomena and all its referrings, following these correctly will lead to God, which is an experience not reducible to explanation. This resembles a phenomenological suspension of the natural attitude, à la Husserl, followed by an acceptance, again, à la Husserl, as experience given in full. Somehow, though, which Husserl doesn't admit, from this phenomenon, the movement to God can begin. I think it's Dionysius' realist tendency here that provides the key difference. So importantly for the Dionysius and realist understanding of the symbol, these referrings are present in the objects in the world, not merely in the psyche of the subject. So Stein describes fire, a favored scriptural image for God, angels, holy men, other divine things, as the kind of image we ought to endeavor to appreciate. She supposes that fire expresses the likeness of angels and other divine objects to God. Its ability to do so presupposes that it is a relevant image of God. She says that the reason why Scripture is so fond of using it, fire, to God of God himself, must be that fire lends itself in many ways to illustrate the divine essence. There's this just brute fact of contiguity there. Stein quotes a passage from the Celestial Hierarchy in which Pseudo-Dionysius discusses fire. It's quite long, I won't read it all, but I've put it on the screen there. So I count roughly 28 referrings to fire, sort of jumps from the experience of fire to the experience of God, 28 points of Analogia Entis, or the analogy of being. Now, some of these, hidden, remains unknown, also reference an understanding of God as mediated by negative theology, the points of Analogia Entis being positive theology. We must also assume in all of these referrings, and following Stein's earlier account of the constant interrelation between positive and negative theology, that each one of these points, a greater dissimilitude also holds. So we're in a tricky position, but somehow the symbolic process both travels along this via triplex and is a part of it. Somehow these symbols are graspable handholds in the ascent to God, and at every moment in which they're properly deployed, their positive and negative theological functions collaborate. Yeah, I'll stress again that for this to be possible, there must be an objective and real, if mysterious, likeness between what it is like to experience fire and what it's like to experience God. Again, this is philosophically problematic. How do we know that we've encountered God? Well, it's a rehearsal of a Meno problem almost. I won't go into the problem, but Stein's answer here to this problem, she phrases this problem as, how can the prophet be sure that he has had an experience of God? She answers that the prophet has an ineffable but definite feeling of encountering God. For her, this ineffable experience is real and can dovetail with certain other experiences. She writes that when Isaiah had this feeling, it was accompanied by an extraordinary attendant phenomenon, the experience of fire. This feeling comes to be the standard to which other experiences can be compared in order to recognize their points of similitude with the experience of God. As such, it is this feeling which allows the theologian to form symbolic language. They can judge their other experiences and highlight reference to God in them. Stein thinks this feeling is identical with mystical experience. It's at the summit of the Via Triplex. So if they're accepted in full and as symbol, these experiences are where the referrings lead, and they will facilitate this symbolic phenomenology. So she does consider some more complex symbols than fire. She considers the mixing bowl, which requires synthesis of other symbols. And she also considers the experience of symbol for those who are not prophets or holy men or psalmists or whatever. Here, the empathetic acceptance of the experience of the other and the idea of initiation into a shared community is absolutely vital. It is because of the mediation of prophets, psalmists, and mystics that ordinary people are initiated into faith and can begin to experience the world as referring symbolically to God. Faith, for Stein, is an open acceptance of testimony to God, and an initiation into a shared world and shared symbolic mentality with those who give this testimony. Stein comments that symbolic reference from phenomena to God is not accessible only to these chosen people, the psalmists, etc. The whole point of their mission rather assumes that others too can find God along this path. So the role of the symbolic theologian is to bring others to a stage when they too can move from the experience of phenomena to God, without those people necessarily having this feeling of in advance. So different symbols require different intensities and patterns of affirmation and negation in order to reach God. They also require different levels of teaching, training, initiation. Stein does not understand this training and initiation as an unquestioning acceptance of what one is told, which is how Husserl critiques the natural attitude. Rather, this acceptance is an unbiased admittance of the testimony of another into one's own life experience, and the recognition of its resonance with the way in which the natural word is given. So it's like accepting this testimony without bias as a phenomena itself, which is real. This acceptance of testimony is again reminiscent of Stein's early work on the place of empathy in phenomenology, and again her openness to the real. In The Science of the Cross, Stein's last major writing, in which I think this symbolic phenomenology sort of continues, she says that the example of the saints show us externally how things should actually be internally in ourselves. So she says of the example of the saints that where there is genuine, lively faith, the tremendous deeds of God are the content of life. She calls this holy realism. To move briefly back to ways to know God, in this book on Dionysius, article on Dionysius, we learn that there comes a point which are reached only by a chosen few. So there's a quotation here, where theology as a way to God can go no further. This is complex, and her use of what we call cheirogogia, or leading by the hand. This is an interesting pedagogical notion that she takes from Dionysius, and she sees this in John of the Cross as well. Okay, I won't read the quote out here, but the idea is that there is a point at which symbolic theology can go no further. We're now in God's affair. So let's see. Anyway, yeah. So I read Science of the Cross as presenting John having attained the last stage beyond symbolic theology, but nevertheless, somehow, using symbols as an artist, poet, theologian to describe this non-sensible experience beyond the symbolic. So Stein is interested in John's use of the symbols cross and knight in his testimony to his mystical experience. In John's use, the knight contains within itself a symbolic relation even before it refers to the cross. This is the relation between the cosmic knight and the spiritual knight. Stein gives a thick poetic account of the ways in which the night and its referring are experienced. A little part of this is on the screen here. I read this as quite reminiscent of Dionysius' account of fire. It's a thick phenomenological account, and it's got these referrings which point off towards God. So she moves through the various stages of John's dark night, and she layers the symbol of the night of the senses, the night of the spirit, the active night, the passive night. She layers these upon one another, and through the various stages of this negation, we move beyond symbol somehow, but the symbol of the night is not left behind. It's sort of modified. So the night is threatening when it impinges on us from the outside, but we're also shocked interiorly by the night itself. It's a quotation from Science of the Cross. These horrible interior and exterior effects do dovetail in our experience. The night robs us of our senses, even as it banishes us in loneliness. We feel the effects externally and internally. However, Stein says the cosmic night already has a double face. The other face, other than this horrible, isolating, lonely, impinging face, is a moonlit magic night. It dispenses to all things a glowing nocturnal visage. Her early phenomenological analysis of face-to-face encounter, I mentioned before, the tearful face, echoes here. She notes about the dark night, just as facial expressions can express another person's interiority, the spiritual and even the divine can reveal itself in nature. In this revelation, a phenomenon, the night, leads the subject or soul to the divine, but is not left behind. Rather, it is transformed. Indeed, Stein says the second face of the night is nocturnal light that reveals a new world deep in the interior and at the same time illumines the outer world from within, so that this outer is given back to us as entirely transformed. This transformation is what allows holy writers to give symbolic testimony to the experience of mystical union with God, or at least to the moments immediately either side of this union. There is a notion in Stein's later writings, including in Science of the Cross, that saints who have miraculously come to know God become, in a way, symbols themselves. They are set aflame, and they can be seen externally as fire or as fiery. Stein tells us that if the soul, in John's poem, having reached the darkest point of the night, were to remain peacefully surrendered to this dark contemplation, it would soon experience what the Song of the Night calls the inflaming love. She also quotes John's testimony to an inflow of God, which, if not hampered, fires the soul. This contiguity between the experiences of fire and the experience of mystical union with God in the darkest point of the night comes across as paradoxical. Nevertheless, somehow the contiguity enables and grounds the symbolic reference between the night and the divine. It comes through as brute reality, almost. Stein notes in both Ways to Know God and the Science of the Cross that the darkness of God in the Dionysian tradition, which John is in and deliberate and consciously follows, and quotes here, is a ray of darkness, a blinding light which we cannot see but is the origin of all visibility. She's got this nice summary here. After the dark night, the living flame shines forth. This is what I mean by this transformation. So finally, I'll note that in Stein's hagiographies in The Hidden Life, she frequently displays fire to symbolize seemingly paradoxical experience beyond or after where symbolic theology leads the saint. Even if one's internal experience is unable to be mediated by finite image or concept, one can be seen externally as fiery. So even when one is in this completely ineffable, mysterious union, mystical union, the external still dovetails or is contiguous with that experience and can be seen externally as fire. Anyway, so I found interesting examples of this fiery symbolism to describe various saints. They're particularly prevalent in Stein's writing on Teresa of Avila, whose testimony famously ignited Stein herself when she accepted it into her life world. I'll just mention now that when she's introducing St. Elizabeth of Hungary, Stein claims that the lovingly penetrating gaze of the researcher who traces out the hidden sparks from testimonies from and about the saints. What this researcher does is they let a flame flare up. Stein tells us that the fiery love of God became Elizabeth's inner form, and that her soul also had an outer form suitable to its inner one. Again, this idea of dovetailing. This also suggests something of Stein's attitude to philosophical and theological research. Again, it is marked by her realism and by her empathy, and by her entire philosophy of life. So I'll just begin to sum up. So in Ways to Know God, Stein indicates that in order for the testimony of saints to describe mystical experience in a way that could be understood and followed, one must presuppose a real, if mysterious, dovetailing between internal and external, and between experiences of phenomena like fire and of the experience of God. In Science and the Cross and in The Hidden Life, Stein displays her empathetic understanding of the testimony of saints. In her later life, we know that she herself worked to follow these saints. I've suggested that in her later writings, Stein deploys her phenomenological skill and adopts a Dionysian understanding of symbolism. In doing so, she demonstrates a philosophically and theologically optimistic realism that is deeply theological, but does not leave phenomenology entirely behind. What I call her symbolic phenomenology of God is positioned to the contrary of the solipsistic and even nihilistic extremes to which other developments of the phenomenological project have run. I therefore believe Stein's later writings should be thought of as important contributions, not only to theological and spiritual communities, but to philosophical and phenomenological ones as well. And that's a sort of what I've got as a sort of short run through of my master's dissertation. But thank you so much for listening and your time, and I'd welcome any questions or feedback. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samuel. It was wonderful. Can I see if there's any questions? Yeah, I think you have to, because I cannot see. Oh, I can see more now. No, I don't understand. I think I can only see, and therefore also only see the hands of the panelists. That means you have to actually write either in the chat or in the question and answer function a question so that we can channel it. While you're thinking, Thomas has his hand up. You can, at least I can see your hand, Thomas. Yeah, go ahead. You're muted. You're muted. No, I think you're fine now. No, you're not. Thomas, the thing is, you're actually there twice. I don't know whether that means something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Samuel, for your paper. I wonder, with this question of holy realism and your link of it with speculative realism, which I think is an interesting avenue, do you think that faith is something that you need to have in order to experience holy realism, or is holy realism something that can lead you to faith? Does that make sense? Like, what has to come first? Yeah,
so Stein's she's actually a little bit on the hedge about this question. She says she says something like the psalmists, who the holy writers, she's not sure whether they have they're certainly grounded on faith, but she talks about the rolling thunder and how the voice of God was heard on the rolling thunder over the desert, wherever they were, and she's not sure about whether that counts. So she's using this holy realism as a sort of God-infused version of natural phenomenology, of experiencing natural phenomena, arriving at arriving at of the natural sciences almost. And she says for the what holy realism means is that when the psalmist hears the voice of thunder over the desert, it is God's voice. Those two things are inseparable. And what she does in Ways to Know God is she argues for natural phenomena as a starting point for a way to know God, almost because she feels she ought to if she's going to be systematic. She's very unsure about the relationship between natural knowledge of God and faith-based knowledge of God, and she does admit the possibility of natural knowledge of God in that way, without faith. In the case of these holy writers, she's not sure whether Dionysius thinks that, but she seems to think that it is possible, but probably only in these situations when the person is in such, it's almost when the person has it's hard to put this into phenomenological terms, but when they have fully sort of suspended their natural attitude, suspended everything they already think they know, and if they genuinely experience these natural phenomena with full openness, I don't think she necessarily thinks faith has to be in there. It just would, if we were fully open to it, point directly to God. But yeah,
that wasn't her experience herself. I mean, as someone who stopped praying, but kind of finding through these different chance encounters that God was somehow, something was going on that she wasn't expecting.
Yeah. I mean, she's in these texts. She's actually very careful not to talk about her own experience. She's deliberately being, and this is why the book on Dionysius and on John of the Cross, they're often sort of sneered at a little bit by philosophers for being completely theological. And there was actually in the initial publication of Ways to Know God, two of the referees who it was sent to, one of them said, "Great, put it in the Phenomenology journal. It's great phenomenology," with a little bit of with something like with only as much doctrinal baggage as could be expected. Whereas the other referee said, "No, absolutely not. This is pure theology. It should be published in a theological journal," which eventually it was in English in the Thomist. So they listened to the latter. But there is this. This is kind of what I was trying to get at. Is she doing theology? Is she doing phenomenology? That seems to have been difficult to tell right from the beginning. But in my opinion, she is very professional, philosophically speaking. She doesn't really talk about her own mystical experiences or whatever. Clearly, there's a deep interest there in the background. But I think she doesn't talk much about her own life, and she's just giving this systematic account, which is why I think it could be helpful to philosophers.
There is a question from Joyce Berkman that is a little bit following up on this in the chat, or in the question and answer session. To what extent is her outlook pantheistic? Is there an equality among phenomena in offering mystic connection with the divine? Is a leaf of grass as useful as fire? Is Jung's assumption of symbols as collective true? Or are we very individuated in our tapping of phenomena to link to God?
Yeah, I mean, this is almost a politically charged question, or could be, because of Stein's conversion from Judaism to Christianity. She obviously talks about the pre-Christian psalmists and this idea of the voice of God over the thunder. She thinks that can lead to God. She also mentions the grossest and lowest natural phenomena, stones, worms, which are mentioned by Dionysius as well. She does seem to think that those are part of this grand vision, this hierarchy, and therefore could form the basis or starting point. There's a definite distinction between simple symbols for God, like fire, and more complex ones. So the mixing bowl, which is, you've got to understand the various things and synthesize them. So some images are definitely more direct, but I think for her, and as a corollary of this Dionysian all-encompassing metaphysical vision, there is as much of a chance for the blade of grass to be used as a symbol pointing to God as fire or whatever. As for the pantheistic, I mean, you can't get around the fact that for Stein the cross is central. The knight refers to the cross. All of these, the summit of these repeated nights is the darkest night, the passive night is an imitation of Christ. The night of the senses is negated. The night of the soul is negated in imitation of Christ's being forsaken on the cross. So you can't get around the centrality of the cross there. But because of the Dionysian and some of the pre-Christian influences on there, I think, I don't know about pantheistic, but there's certainly all phenomena, if they're accepted in this unbiased, open way with all its referrings, should lead to God, I think.
Thanks very much, Sam. I think since you used Chenu as a vehicle for distinguishing between sign and symbol, I think you're not aware that Stein is quite elaborately making that distinction herself in On the Problem of Empathy.
No, I'm not sure. I haven't worked much on, I mean, I've barely done more than sort of flick through Stein's earliest work. So that is
I'll
really
give you the page numbers because I think
yeah.
it's the key that it's the piece that I think you're missing.
Amazing.
In the English edition, it is page 76 to 83. So it's very much towards the end.
Oh, that's wonderful, yeah.
And
yeah, I sort of found that distinction in Chenu as a convenient thing, but it's wonderful that Stein talks about it herself, yeah.
No, and the reflection on symbolicism and is actually there from the very, very beginning. Actually, in her Staatsexamensarbeit, so the treatise she wrote before she wrote the doctoral treatise, it is quite clearly probably playing a bigger role because it played a very large role in Lips's understanding of empathy. And therefore, it also plays in Husserl's notes on her Staatsexamensarbeit, it plays a very important role. So she's not in agreement with Lips, and that's why, because he thinks that everything is symbolical, and she thinks that means he hasn't got a real take on what symbol means, and that's why she has to elaborate what a symbol is. And I'll just give you her definition here on page 76. Symbol means that in something perceived, there is something else. Now, a sign is distinct from that because it can be arbitrary. It can be determined what the sign signifies, as in amber signifies hot. That's a cultural thing, but a symbol is not a sign. It can't be determined in the same way as a sign. And that's what the realism is about. It has in itself something more than itself. And that's why, of course, the whole world can be read symbolically of the creator. In fact, it would be very strange if we couldn't, because analogical thinking is precisely that. That we see in and through all being its creator, God.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you. I'll have to revisit. Well, I'll have to visit those. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Welcome. Anyone else? No? Otherwise, here it's late and dark. And I'm sure that everybody in my time zone needs something to eat shortly. Thanks very much for these two very rich presentations. And see you all tomorrow. God bless. And good night.